Good morning. It's Friday, July 19th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 287 days old. I'm Jonathan Shanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. A special thank you to my colleague Jonathan Conricas for not only hosting the last 3 episodes, but for also bringing on some serious star power, senior figures from within the Israeli system. As for me, I spent a few days out west and unplugged. I got refreshed, recharged, and ready to get back into the saddle here. But that was before I spent half the night last night watching the breaking news out of Israel. The Houthis in Yemen have scored a successful drone attack on Tel Aviv. It happened a little past 3 a.m. in Israel last night. 1 person was killed and approximately 7 were injured. The attack was the first of its kind on Tel Aviv since this war began. It's a useful reminder that this is a multi-front war being waged by Iran and its proxies across the Middle East. In other words, this is not just about Gaza, not by a long shot, folks. Thankfully, the attack itself was not more deadly or destructive, but from what we can discern, the Houthis' intended target was actually American diplomats. Their mark was the U.S. consulate compound on Hayarkon Street. But the drone missed its target, and that's good news for us here in the U.S. But for Israel, the psychological impact of the enemy breaching the walls of Fortress Tel Aviv is hard to ignore. That's the theme I'm picking up from the Israeli media right now. The Israelis have declined to respond directly to Houthi aggression until this point. That's because all of the Houthi attacks have been thwarted by Israeli missile defense. That's obviously no longer the case. So welcome to yet another phase of the 10-7 wars. Our guest this morning will be Danielle Pletka. Danny is a distinguished fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She's a former Senate staffer and a current professor at Georgetown. She has a Substack called What the Hell is Going On? She's got great insights into a number of topics we'll talk about today live here on the FDD Morning Brief. I often tell people that I'm a paid pessimist, Dr. Doom, if you will. It's prudent to have a negative outlook when your business is analyzing the Middle East. Well, guess what? Here's a bit of good news. I think Israel's on the cusp of defeating Hamas. The heavy fighting in Gaza may soon be over. Part of this stems from the pinpoint intelligence the Shin Bet, Israel's domestic spy agency, is still able to obtain. That kind of intelligence led to the airstrike that very likely killed Mohammed Deif, the most senior Hamas military leader, just a few days ago. The Israelis have whacked a bunch of other senior Hamas terrorists in Gaza and in Lebanon, and they get the better of Hamas in every direct confrontation in the Gaza Strip. But the game changer was when the Israelis took the Philadelphi corridor, that thin strip of land astride the Egyptian border. After that, they began to block the tunnels that had allowed Hamas to come and go. Those tunnels were also the transit route for Hamas weapons smuggling. It's not rocket science, folks. Cut off your enemy's supply lines, and your enemy is in deep trouble. But no good news is entirely good news in the Middle East. The question now is whether the Israelis would even want a hostage deal with a victory in sight. A ceasefire would only allow Hamas to regroup. Talk about a painful gambit. There are likely some difficult decisions ahead for the Israeli government and for their military. We'll all be watching. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, American, Israeli, and Palestinian Authority officials secretly met in Tel Aviv last week to discuss post-war arrangements. Shh. Don't tell anyone. The Rafa crossing reportedly topped the agenda. The group, which included White House Middle East advisor Brett McGurk, director of Israel's Shin Bet, Ronan Bar, and PA intelligence chief Majid Faraj, they all discussed plans to reopen the crossing on the border with Egypt. The crossing will ostensibly be critical to facilitate the first phase of a future ceasefire. Wounded Hamas members will reportedly be transported to Egypt via Rafa to receive medical care. U.S. officials also say that reopening the crossing could pave the way for broader Gaza reconstruction efforts, including the establishment of governance structures involving the PA. Israeli officials are reportedly open to the idea of an unofficial PA presence at the Rafah crossing, and American officials agree that it's not a bad idea for the PA to have a foot in the door in Gaza, but the PA is allegedly gunning for something more formal, and the Israelis are having none of that, at least for right now. Headline 2, the Biden administration privately warned Iran last month about the regime's nuclear activities. The warning came on the heels of new intel, which suggested that Iranian scientists were engaging in computer modeling and other research relevant to weaponization efforts. Predictably, the Iranians explained this all away, insisting that their policy has not changed and that they are not interested in producing a nuke. The White House seemingly bought their BS. An unnamed U.S. official told Axios that the Biden administration does not believe Iran is currently undertaking the key activities, blah, 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 necessary to build a bomb. That's been a Washington talking point since 2019, but my FDD colleague Jacob Nagel, who served as Prime Minister Netanyahu's national security advisor, disagrees. He told Axios that dozens of Iranian scientists have indeed been working under an academic umbrella on the technical processes needed to produce atomic weapons. Nobody pulls the wool over the eyes of Jacob Nagel, folks. And headline 3, global soccer's governing body, FIFA, may soon ban Israel from international competition. FIFA has resisted pressure to expel Israel in years past, but calls to give Israel the boot are growing louder. 2 months ago, the Palestinian Football Association requested that FIFA expel Israel over the war in Gaza. FIFA decided to consult legal experts and postpone its decision until its July 20th board meeting. The experts, who coincidentally authored the legal analysis, are, oh, you're going to love this, they're South African attorneys who were also part of the team prosecuting the genocide case, that bogus genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Well, what do you know? They concluded erroneously that Israel is violating international law and should be banned from international soccer. A petition circulated by a nonprofit to ban Israel from competition has garnered over 390,000 signatures. The Asian Football Confederation and the Jordan Football Association also endorsed the Israeli ban. With pressure mounting, we'll see if FIFA makes its move, but you'll get no optimism from me here, folks. FIFA is totally corrupt. You'll recall that the Qataris literally bought the 2022 World Cup with bribes. Okay, it's now time for my interview with Danielle Pletka. She's a distinguished fellow over at AEI. Previously, she was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She has a great podcast co-hosted with Mark Thiessen called What the Hell is Going On, which is the same title as her Substack. The name What the Hell is apt because it's a question I've asked myself just about every morning for the past 8 or 9 months. So let's find out what the hell is going on live right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome, Danielle Pletka.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. Well, let's start with just maybe a review of what happened last night. Let's talk about that attack. The Houthis have claimed responsibility. It seems like a widening of the war to me, but maybe it was just a one-off. How do you think this changes things, if it does at all?
I think, first of all, we're thinking about this the wrong way. And I mean, even us, the good guys, this is not about the Houthis. The Houthis are a front. This is the Iranians, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Hashd-e-Shaabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces inside Iraq. These guys have some semblance of an independent operation, but mostly they are proxies for Iran. And we know that. Apart from anything else, we already know that the drone, which is Iranian-made, which has been altered probably by Iranian techs in Yemen, that landed in Tel Aviv, is something that the Iranians have engineered. This is what we saw when there was a quote-unquote Houthi attack on the United Arab Emirates. There was a quote-unquote Houthi attack on Saudi Arabia. All of those things suggest to us, first of all, that we're dealing with Iran. And even if we hit the Houthis hard, the Iranians don't give a damn because they don't give a damn about their proxies. So that's sort of number one. Is it a widening of the conflict, to use the Biden administration's favorite term, a widening of the conflict? Yes, hitting Tel Aviv is a real vulnerability. I think Tel Avivis feel like they're not part of this in the same way, and it's going to get an angry population, angry about what the Israeli government is doing about the war in Gaza, angry about the process of negotiating for the hostages, angry about what's happening in the north and the fact that the government isn't dealing with Hezbollah. It's going to get them even angrier. And
I do wonder sort of whether that is a good thing. I mean, fighting out of anger, obviously that's what war is. But one does have to ask whether the Israelis have a long-term strategy. That's something that I've been asking about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for quite some time. We'll obviously hear more from him in Washington soon. But I do want to pivot to Egypt with you. Let's start with a little context behind the current headlines. Talk to us about why members of Congress and Democratic administrations in particular have had it out for the Egyptian regime for the last decade.
So this is a great question. And Egypt is one of those sort of things that doesn't get talked about enough. First of all, the Egyptians have been terrible in a myriad of ways for way longer than a decade, but they've always been protected, especially by the executive branch, by the White House. Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter. George Bush, I'm just finishing a book chapter writing about the freedom agenda of the Bush administration and how Egypt just got 100% pass, right? And then, of course, Barack Obama rejects this freedom agenda. And where does he make that speech? He makes it in Cairo, which is just sort of irony of ironies. Now, what have the Egyptians been up to? Since Sisi, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president, came to power, he has consolidated. Obviously, he has not just put the Muslim Brotherhood behind bars, which I think a lot of Americans are very comfortable with, but put basically all of his opponents behind bars, including everybody who notices the fact that all the money in Egypt seems to go into his pockets of his cronies. Just as a little aside about this, I had a meeting with a very senior Saudi economic official. And you may actually have been there, Jonathan, I don't remember. But we were talking about corruption in the region. And he said, it used to be Iran. He said, I used to really worry about the Iranians. Whenever we would do anything there, everyone was on the take. You'd never get your deal done. He said, now I don't even worry about the Iranians as much as I worry about the Egyptians. He said, that it used to be you'd have to give a bribe to the president and a bribe to the business people. Now, he said, you have to give a bribe to the president and a bribe to the military. When the Saudis are talking about you, the Saudis are talking about you like that, you are in trouble. And the IMF is now down on them. From the perspective of the US Congress, it's not just the human rights violations that some people have finally noticed. It's also the fact that because the United States has been playing just a little tiny bit of hardball. We give them $1.23 billion in mostly military assistance every year. We've been withholding about $300 million of that on human rights grounds. But because the Egyptians have recognized that perhaps the Americans aren't going to be as stupid as we have been over the last 50 plus years, they've turned to the Chinese and the Russians. And so when war broke out between the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Egyptians were actually supplying the Russians. Okay, there's talk about them putting a base there. We now have multiple Chinese military state visits at Egyptian ports. Well, this is not an insignificant thing when you talk about the fact that the Egyptians control the Suez Canal and everything else. So, long rant about the Egyptians, but that's the deal.
Got it. Okay, good, useful primer here. So now, okay, for the question that I think I've always wanted to ask a Senate staffer, or in your case, a former one, but it's still highly relevant. What happens when Congress gets the full picture of the tunnels that Egypt has been operating on behalf of Hamas along that Philadelphi corridor? At some point, I got to think this starts to come out officially in our media. How do you expect Congress, the administration, others to respond?
Right. So everybody who's watched your briefings knows the Egyptians have been playing a double game, right? They work with the Israelis, intel at the senior level, and at the same time, probably members of the president's family are on the take for weapons smuggling through Rafa. And this has been hugely important and a real lifeline for Hamas, right? Which we should remind people is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which we should remind people Sisi says he hates, and which the Egyptian government put on a terrorism list. But money is money. What happens? So what needs to happen is that Congress slams the brakes on all of U.S. financial assistance to Egypt. Will that happen? It ought to have happened a long time ago. It's not like this hasn't been going on for a long time. And by the way, it's not like U.S. intelligence didn't know about this. Okay? So the question then becomes, will the people who have been fronting for Egypt, particularly in the Senate, particularly on the Appropriations Committee, for whom Egypt can just do no wrong. Will they finally allow the authorizers, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, leadership, and everybody else to go after the Egyptians? I hope that's what we're going to see next year. It'll be really interesting. What'll actually be interesting for you and for me is if they don't do it, right? If they don't go after the Egyptians, because then we will know that it's not just Senator Menendez who just got convicted of, taking gold bars from people, including, by the way, Egyptian intelligence, right? It's not just Senator Menendez who has an extra cozy relationship. Maybe other people aren't on the take, but their relationship with the Egyptians is dictating that they pursue policies that are against America's interests.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Menendez case. It's bizarre. Obviously, he's been great on things like Iran, but apparently he's pretty cozy with the Egyptians and bizarrely also the Qataris, which is a strange combo. But that's probably a conversation for another time. But I absolutely agree with you that the decisions made by the U.S. government, I think there's a real temptation to sweep all of this under the rug, which I think is a recipe for more messes in the Middle East over the long haul. But again, probably another time for that. Another question. You and I recently participated in an interesting Zoom meeting, actually, that you called, and I thank you for it. We were trying to game out Hezbollah's next moves. That was a few weeks ago. Where are you on this right now? What do you think's happening in the north?
It was a really interesting Zoom because it was all of our friends, the usual suspects, and we couldn't agree. No one could really figure out what a good end game was. And if you fit it into the context that I think you have talked about, which is this larger Iranian game plan for the destruction of the state of Israel, then okay. But then why not seize the moment, right? If Hezbollah is part of a bigger Iranian plan, which has been articulated and sitting on the website of the supreme leader, translated by memory of all things, so we know what their plan is, right? It's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's also the PA and Arabs inside Israel. Finally, putting the last nail in the coffin of the evil Zionist entity. Okay, that's fine as a plan, but that would suggest that Hezbollah should be all in right now. And while I think what started as ankle biting at the beginning of the war, right after October 7th, has now escalated into very serious problems for the Israelis in terms of the north, Kiryat Shmona, the fires, loss of life. It's still not, what their capabilities are in terms of Hezbollah. And so, again, I got to tell you, Jonathan, I watch this and I just still ask myself what the game is for them. If they're just testing, why don't they just go all in? One thing that this really is doing is further undermining the Netanyahu government, because if there are people who are like, get the hostages out, make a ceasefire now for Hamas, there's much, much smaller minority that says, don't go in now and kill Hezbollah. And so that pressure is going to be very serious. And yet we've not really seen any more serious moves, although it did look like last week they did try to kill Nasrallah.
Yeah, I do note that as of this morning, right before heading on this program, I noted that there were 60 different projectiles fired into Israel by Hezbollah. That was just this morning. We see that escalation, but I think you're right. Hezbollah has not made the determination to go all in. My thesis when we talked on that call is that I think Iran and its proxies are still probing to see whether this is the right moment for that full ring of fire to be activated. I think we continue to watch them test the Israeli air defenses and to see Israel's responses. And at some point, we may see a more significant escalation. But I've got one more question for you before we let you go.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah, of course.
What happens when they decide in the Middle East that Donald Trump is going to win the elections?
Good question. And
does that change their calculus?
Last time around, I think you and I both know the Iranians really felt like they were getting the squeeze from the Trump administration. I think a lot of actors were very fearful of how unpredictable Donald Trump would be in the event of a full-blown conflagration across the Middle East, and that he might, just lay waste to some of these bad actors. I have to say, I think the chances of that are still pretty high, given the fact that now there's this talk about a possible Iran-led assassination, attempt against Trump. But I also have to wonder in the same breath, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. I mean, this is a president that's never been tested in wartime, right? This is a guy that went 4 years without real conflict. What does it mean when this guy comes in, inherits the presidency, if he does, and would he be willing to be more aggressive? This was a guy that always went for diplomacy first, right? All about the deal. Is that really where he's going to be if he steps back in again?
Yeah, well, so that's the big question for us. At the end of his Fidel Castro-esque speech last night at the Republican National Convention, he goes back in his final minutes to Hamas and he says, let those hostages go and do it before I am president, or you will pay the price. Now, putting his money where his mouth is okay. Let's see that happen. But it was interesting.
Reagan, by the way, right? I mean, the idea of getting hostages released right before you come in.
Absolutely. So, look, I mean, that's the upside. The JD Vance side suggests to me that, they hunker down in a padded room and spend the time, watching videos of themselves from yesteryear. So I don't know what they do. And I agree with you. I think it's a question. But I do think that our friends in the region are going to be very, very nervous about this. So, yeah.
Tend to agree. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Danielle Pletka, for joining us live on the FDD Morning Brief and telling us what the hell is going on.
It is an apt title.
It is.
Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Only a policy of strength will push Tehran to stand down. Okay, that's a wrap for today.
Thanks for watching. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and hit subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Until next time, stay informed and inspired. This is Djobnik signing off.